Hello everyone, this is Piupz, and today we resume the ISO research for the second part on the custom analysis here in Solver. We're gonna mainly take a look at the turn nodes and how to simplify our bet sizing on the turn. We're gonna visualize all the turns for simplified bet sizes and take a look if this board structure follows a bit the logic from King 5-3. We saw that on King 5-3, which was a very rainbow board and disconnected board, and a board which is like dry, right? It doesn't connect very well with like the in position pair range, which is like more middle-ish heavy, right? So we saw 100% C betting, and on top of that, we saw that on the turn there was no shoves, right? No shoves on the turn, and we saw as like mostly two bet size being used, like the 230 bet size, which was like smaller than 2E, I guess. I don't remember correctly, but like it was very similar sizing, right? Like around half stack behind. We should bet on the turn mostly, right? We saw some adaptation versus players that actually don't have the pocket eights, pocket nines, and so forth, like in that board in their turn starting range, right? We saw that the blank cards were like way more aggressive versus the players that don't have those cards, and the high cards were quite way bad, worse than in Equilibrium, right? Because in Equilibrium in the queen, for example, king 5-3 queen, we were to bet a lot in equilibrium the queens because we could make indifferent the pocket pairs, which were like a very big region of the or not very big, but a dense region of the imposition players range, right? And when they don't have that because they raise on the flop, or I mean they don't have in the starting range and so forth, well, it becomes worse, right? The queen, then suddenly we cannot barrel that aggressively the queens anymore because the range is more polar, and there's like a different set of incentives for our range, right? Now we're now looking at a different board structure, right? For the first difference is that we have a checking range, right? The bet size, the best bet size, like around 30%, but you can also use 2E. We saw that the EV difference in the last coaching, we saw the EV difference in between 30% and 2E was like non-existable, right? So it's like a matter of preference. But of course, if you make a bigger investment on the flop, right, for your range, you have to bet less, right? Because the investment will remain more or less the same, right? You are committed to every certain type of board versus every certain type of range. When you have a matchup between one range and the other, you are committed in a way, in theory, for an investment into the pot, right? And then if you change your bet sizing, there is going to be sometimes EV difference, right? If you go to a bet size which is like not optimal for the incentives of your range to realize their equity, right? So their EV is going to reduce. But if you stay within a margin of like acceptable strategy construction that don't lose EV in theory, the only difference will be the amount of investment that you make on the pot, right? If you stay within that margin, you're not going to lose EV, but you have to manage your investment, right? If you reduce the bet sizing within that margin that don't lose EV versus equilibrium, you invest less. If you bet more frequently, sorry, and if you go for a bigger size region within that spectrum, you have to bet less, right? But it's a matter of preference, right? The bet size that you use within that margin is just a matter of preference, right? It's like whether you want to simplify for a certain bet size region, it's your preference. Like you're used to play a half pot. I don't know. It shouldn't matter in this case here. Um, Now we see that there's a checking range here, and some of the main hands of checking range, guys. What do you think are the main region? If you look at this, like what do you say that's like the higher density of the checking range here composed with? Come on, chat. The question is like, what's the main component of the checking range? It's like a reduced checking range, but there is a checking range here, and what's the main component? Set, trash, and trap. Yes, right? It's like very trash heavy range, right? If you look at the pure air without the backdoor flush shot, it's checking pure, right? So it's a texture that those type of hands, as out of position player in a scenario where in position actually have a equity disadvantage, but it actually has a lot of realization because it has a lot of draws, and draws in position player have like really huge realization, right? In general, that's why out of position player in general optimizes to make those draws indifferent at some point, right? So either indifferent to raise or call, or indifferent to fold or raise, and whatever, right? Find ways to make that draws lose their EV, because when you cause, in theory, when you cause some part of the player's range to be indifferent, you cause that part to have the EV marginalized. Let's say it gets to be maximally pressured, right? Because you are forced into a difficult decision. You're forced into being different with that region. In human terms, like when you make someone indifferent, then you make their life in average difficult, right? Trash without vector flush draw. Yes, king high flush draw probably as well. Well, let's see. Mm, mm, it actually there's like a very small relation of like not being the case. Like it's not the case. King high flush draws. More like king highs in general, they check a lot, right? Inside this checking range, there is like, so if you look at the average, so let's look at this box here, guys. This box on the right, the left here, right? This is the frequency of hands. It's the same when you filter on wizard, right? Like it updates based on the checking range and whatsoever, right? So if you look at the nothing here, they're like the average frequency of the board is 18% checks, and if you look at the nothing, it's going to be 25% of checks. And if you filter for those very bad hands, so if you go for equity here, the low equity portion, they have like 44% checks, right? So if you go for hands in between 15 and 25% equity here, and if you go for the very low, it's very difficult to have hands that have like 0 to 15% equity here, right? Because in on the flop, even very weak air they tend to not have. So it's only 0.8%, but you can see that the 0.8% that is contained within the class is like always checking, right? And uh, as you go lower, lower equity seems like very well related to check, right? So you don't want to inflate the pot with those hands, but you don't want to also give incentive for opponent that you check and then he always bets, right? And then he generate folds very easily. He could win a lot of money this way, right? So you have to check some strong hands as well, and some of the middle hands they also check a bit, right? They check a bit more than the average bet frequency, but they still mostly bet, right? So if you go for king highs, for example, there are hands that have the high checking frequency, but yeah. So if you filter for hands like king queen, king jack, king 10, you see that, so king highs that have their two overcards, you see that their frequency is 22% check. So mostly they still bet, but they check a bit more than the average board frequency, right? So there are hands that are kind of heavy in the checking range, right? Because of that. But not so much, right? Not so much as there. So if you filter only for checking range here, you're gonna see that 56% of that range is nothing here. Nothing still includes those 10 highs that have one overcard to the 8 and so on. If you filter only for 4, 3, and so on, you're gonna have a very high frequency. So if you filter for 4, 3, 5, 3, right? 6, 3, so on, they have like very high checks, right? Very high checks. So if you filter for 4, 3, and 6, 3, for example, wow, 92% checks, right? Um, Max saying something here. Yeah, I think it's the most hard part, not make your range on the flop with only set plus trash because you are so polar. Yes, right? If you make the range that way, it's not a huge problem. It is a problem. Don't get me wrong, it is a problem. But it's not a huge problem as long as you play properly with that range, right? If you make a range stress and trap heavy, when you face a bet, you should always raise, not call, right? You should not have a calling range then, right? If you bet all your king highs and you make a range like trash or trap, when you face a bet, you have to charge your opponent with a raise, right? You only raise him. You cannot call them, right? well, you're gonna find a way to raise, right? You're gonna find a way to raise some trash with the traps, right? To make him indifferent. So you want to make him indifferent, like queen high, king queen, and so on, right? You want to reduce the EV of betting those hands, right? You want to create a different difficult decision for him in case he wants to bet, right? So you're gonna charge him in a way that you're gonna demand from him an investment, right? Like if he bets and he gets fold without a huge investment and causing indifference in his range, he's going to profit a lot, right? But if you check and he bets and then he gets more folds than if you had king highs, but actually you raise him more, well, the investment still high for him enough, right? You still charge him a high investment, right? A proper investment, let's say, right? The same logic as out of position here, having to invest some amount of money. It's true for in-position player depending on how the our position builds its checking range, right? Every checking range that our position can have in a spot will demand a different investment from the in-position player, right? If you make your range too weak, well, you allow in position to invest a lot of money and to effectively make you fold hands that have equity, right? It's amazing for him, right? Like if you check only air and king highs, for example, right? You don't check enough traps, which is like the case that we all analyze nowadays, like so like diffuse, right? Everyone knows that some people are kept in some line and so on. It's like a main poker discourse, right? But just to use that as an example, like if you check the ratio capped, well, the imposition player can suddenly like invest a lot of money, and there is like huge benefits of investing a lot of money because you actually make out of position have to let go of hands that have chance of winning the pot by the river, right? If the hands were checked through to the river, some hands like 4-3 off would win the pot by the river, right? And then our imposition can generate that fold from that region of hands that actually have a chance to win against it on the future, right? Because if you compare the equity of a queen high with like 4-3 actually have a lot of equity versus like queen high, right? 4-3 doesn't have a lot of equity and realization versus the whole position range. But if you compare the equity of a 4-3 off with the queen high, 4-3 off have a lot of equity versus that hand, right? If you allow queen high to generate a fold versus you on the flop, like if you translate that to big blind per 100, if you check a cap range, it's going to be huge, right? Like you're gonna capitalize so much money, right? So every opportunity that you have to, for example, based on timing tails or betting size patterns or opponent profiling patterns, you have the opportunity of knowing that your opponent's particularly capped or check only area in a size, that will allow you to win so much money with your range, right? Because then you can just check all the traps, right? Check all the traps in the hands that don't need any folds, and then you bet every hand that needs a fold. And then you want to win so much money, right? Because sometimes you're going to capture with your traps some money in the future, not much, right? You would expect not capture a lot of money with your trap, but you can check through until a point where he catches something and maybe you can value bet. And then all your air that had like very hard time versus realizable checking range from the out of position player will win a lot of money because you bet and generate a fold. So yes, the checking range here is like stuff which is like very polar, but contains some king highs, right? So if you check for the imposition player, well, as a natural consequence of that, like the imposition player strategy would be to bet small, right? He wants to bet small. Um, because your range is polar, so you're gonna overfold, right? So he bets small, like for 25%, out of position folds at a 41%, right? Even if it checks all those king highs and the range is not like perfectly polar in between like traps and air, you're gonna fold 41% versus the float. So it's like a overfolding situation, right? But you charge him with raises, right? You charge him with raises, right? There's a 15% raise. It's very important, right? Because, for example, if you check a range which is like two king high and air heavy, and you don't find the proper bluffs to make your opponent indifferent, and you defend this frequency, but you raise at 10%, for example, you raise only value and not bluffs, well, you make the imposition range realization much higher again, right? Because then he's not charged, right? He can get the 41% folds without having to get raised a lot, right? It's amazing for the imposition play. Whenever you can bet to realize your equity via folds for effective hands to generate folds, and you don't get charged enough via raises, it's amazing, right? This is just the dream scenario, and what happens a lot for human players all over the place, right? If 40% makes draws indifferent, why the size post flop is 30%? Yeah, that's something that I was trying to figure it out, but I don't know. Probably because it set up a size on the turn, which makes the draw indifferent. So it's probably looking to make the draws indifferent on the turn here, on this instance, because I think there's like too many very strong draws that call any size on the flop here. That's the issue, I think. So it's probably trying to set up turn indifference, let's say, or right. Which by the way happens in small blind three-way as well, right? When we saw the big size on the flop, yes, it already folds draws on the flop, but it was a huge incentive to set up the turn shove to fold or making different combo draws and strong flush draws and stuff like that, right? On turn blanks. We really wanted to shove at 15 at least, right? On the turn, and or even like in drawy turn in more dry turns, we at deeper stacks we bet like half pot and we left like very tiny stack behind because that also generates indifference in the flush draws, right? So there's like a portion of draws that actually are denied by the turn, right? In some set of strategies, you're looking to generate some indifference on the flop, which is effective, of course, but you're also setting up some indifference for the turn, right? In you're thinking about the future, right? In poker, like in any game, like the or in, not any game, but in most games, like you in a sequential game, right? You have to think about the future when you make your present decisions, right? It's always relevant, right, to think about the future. And the solver is optimizing this in a scale that as humans we cannot do, right? Unless we analyze the solver and take a look at how it optimizes for the future here. And there is like some optimization for the future here because actually the best bet size within the margins of like decimals, right? Because we saw that in between half pot and 30% there was like no EV difference in terms of like point the one case decimal, right? Maybe in two case decimal, there is like a difference, right? That's why it chooses 30%, right? But it's not relevant for human purposes. But if you bet 30% on the flop, you're making different those one card king highs and hands like queen nine, right? Which is good for your range as well, right? Um, Making folds from queen nine if you have an eight, or if you have like a hand like a queen high yourself is good, right? A low queen high. If you have a king high, generating folds from those hands is also good, right? And and I think one factor here is that a great portion of the imposition range is actually there is no two undercards range really, right? For an imposition player here. That's a feature that I didn't observe at first, but there is just like very few hands that are like two undercards, right, to the board. Just those hands here without the backdoor flush draw. And the ones with the backdoor flush draw, they have like um they have a fold as well. But like there's like very few set of hands that will be two undercards that are like yeah, that's not like so effective to deny equity against, right? The remaining hands are like one overcard, backdoor flush draw, or without backdoor flush draw and stuff like that. So you're making different like queen three backdoor flush draw, you're making different like queen two backdoor flush draw here, for example. And you're making different those king highs here. Now, what's what's the bulk of the raising range versus the bet here, right? So we're facing a float here, so we have 15% raises. So what are some hands that are used as a bluff here, right? You don't need actually to pick air because you're shoving here, right? You're shoving as a bluff. Now, what are the bluffs here? Queen nine. Queen nine seems to be a particularly good bluff here with the backdoor flush draw. It's a pure bet. If you check queen nine here, it's going to be to raise, which is interesting, right? And this is where I think the human players they fail to do this stuff, right? They will tend to do thing value too much and maybe draws too much, but queen nine they don't catch it, right? So let's take a look at queen nine. So queen nine, you interact with pocket nines, you interact with pocket queens, you interact with queen eight, right? And you have solid equity versus the calling range, right? You have solid equity versus the attacks and so forth, right? And yeah, so queen nine seems to be one of the best bluffs here. The pure bluffs, let's say pure no made hands bluff, right? And there's like some king jack as well, king jack, king queen, which are also hands that dominate some of the air that calls, right? Different than queen nine that gets called by queen 10 and queen jack. Actually, queen nine would block those calls, right? Like you never get calls from queen jack if you raise queen nine with the queen of spades, right? Because the only queen jack and queen 10 that calls you are exactly the one with the spade. So if you want to have a king jack raising, guess what? Guess what? If you have a king jack raising, what you don't want if you have a king jack raising. Well, if you have a king jack raising, you really want to get called by queen jack and queen 10, right? You really want to get called by those hands. So you're gonna raise without the spade, right? That's the effect that we see here, right? King jack, king queen without the spade, right? If you have those hands, you really want to have the queen 10, queen jack calling you. And if you have king queen here, you would prefer to have the king of spades. Having the king of spades helps for some reason. Let's see why. So king of spades, you block the flush draws. Yeah, you block the flush draws calls, and you still make it likely that he calls jack 9, jack 10. Jack 9 calls only with the spade, for example, and so forth, right? Yeah. So if you have some king highs raising here for protection and they have some draw equity, you want to maximize the chance that you get called by a weaker no-made hand, right? So you don't want to have the 9 of spades, jack of spades, and so on, right? Because those hands, you really like to have them on the calling range versus you, right? Because those hands boost your equity, right? It's a hand that you're ahead against if you have king jack. So yeah. And then the main bulk of like check raising as like fast playing value here is like pocket nines, pocket tens, pocket jacks, pocket queens. So if you check a pocket pair here, which should check at some frequency, some very low frequency, right? It's important, right? Because it's important. Once you deal with like tiny ranges in equilibrium, and that's you can find also exploits for 0 points, right? But once you deal with tiny ranges, the mixing really matters, right, at this point, because the main bulk of the hands that would charge a bet and still make the range protected for the other position when he checks is that he's going to mostly call its like sets, right? The very strong traps here, they want to always call because they want to not make the imposition player wants to bet very frequently on the turn and deny equity again. But you want to raise the flop, right? Because you have too much area and you overfold. You want to charge the imposition player for betting. And the hands that really charge the imposition player from betting are some of the air that we are analyzing here. So king, jack, king, queen, etc. without the double spade, right? So without the backdoor flush. So we get called by weaker flush draws. We get called by queen, jack, jack, nine, and so on, right? We maximize the chance that we get called by those hands. And and the second portion is like the very low frequency randomized, let's say, right, when we execute pocket jacks, pocket queens, right? Those ones they are checking at a very low frequency, but inside the 18% checking range, they are actually checking like in overall frequency. If you filter for queen jacks, they're checking only 6%. How hard it is to execute this, right? Like if that's why no one can emulate equilibrium strategies, right? So you cannot like even if your opponent's trying to emulate the equilibrium policy, he's going to make mistakes in emulating that, right? And that's the thing that's like it's impossible to execute, but it's good to keep in mind, right? That if you want to charge an opponent or you want to make him indifferent, those hands there are the main components of what charges in the race. And then in equilibrium, like 6% of checks of those hands, right? But they compose a lot of the raising range because although there are 6% checks inside the checking range, they gonna be the hands that always raise the turn here, right? And they are like 20% of the raising range, right? Inside the 15% raising range, they are 20% of that range. So when you get raised by equilibrium here, well, you have like those hands as one of the main components of the value, right? The strongest hands in the raising range. So one 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 feature, right? One one feature that we observe very well in short stack scenarios, in short stack scenarios, so is that fast play team is very incentivized, and trapping with top is very well incentivized, right? We're gonna see that all over the place if you go heads up limpet pot at 8, at 10, right? That two pair they call very frequently, flop turn river versus three barrels, right? And if you go deeper, there is actually way less team value raising. So, for example, top pairs they tend to in short stack scenario, for example, in limpet pot, they tend to check call on the flop sometimes and check raise on the turn. So they tend to mostly check raise on the flop or on the turn, right? They tend to really fast play because they can shove, they can go for the stacks, right? They can end the action, right? That's not true for deeper scenarios, right? In deeper scenarios, you cannot get away with checking pocket tens, pocket jacks. For example, if you ISO 2.5 at 25 and you check pocket queens at this scenario, you cannot get away with shoving and stuff like that, right? Because you're gonna get called only by stronger hands, or you're gonna get called by a hand range that it doesn't make sense. You're gonna fold hands that you get future value against for a marginal situation. Here it's easy, right? You can shove. You can shove team value and call all the traps, right? You don't need the traps in the raising range. So if you want to have a raising range at deeper stacks where there's like so much SPR behind, you should raise some two pair, then you should raise some sets, right? That's what we're gonna see in this kind of scenarios at deeper stacks, right? At deeper stacks, you're gonna see some portion of the sets calling, most of it, but you're gonna see some sets raising, right? Because they want to inflate the pot more. And if you have a team value raising range, you want to have some of the very strongest hands there as well. Here you don't need it, right? As you can see, sets they just always call. There's no raising, right? And then hands that benefit from protection, just fast play. Okay. Any questions regarding those ranges? So Talabi made some consideration here. So the more interaction with the out of position range, the better. Also having two overs to the 8 improve its equity when called. Yes. So for Queen 9, you want to make it less likely, or you make it impossible for your opponent to have Queen Jack calling you, right? So if you have Queen 9 raising as a bluff, you want to really not have Queen Jack in the impositions calling range, or King Queen with because King Queen that calls probably, right? So there is some King Queen betting. And if you shove, actually any King Queen is calling, King Jack is also calling any. It's more like reducing the amount of Queen Jack and Queen 10 calling, right? Yeah. And actually, if you have a backdoor flush draw, right? If you have a backdoor flush draw, if you have the very marginal bluffs, which Queen 9 is in the spot, right? Queen 9 is very clearly one of the weakest bluffs, right? You want to have the backdoor flush as well because it adds some equity, right, for your call, right? You make it less likely that he calls you king, queen with the queen of spades and stuff that would really dominate you, right? So if you have like queen 9 with the queen of spades or 9 of spades, well, you make it less likely that she's going to have king jack and crush you, right? If you have like queen jack, no, because you don't have the jack of spades or the queen of spades, but you make it less likely to have king queen of spade and king 9 of spades, right? Meanwhile, the incentive of the king jack is different, right? Actually is making sense for the first time in a while. Exactly, right? When most people look at GTOs, that's why like different players will look at different like at the same that data structure or the data representation, right? You can look at the same stuff as I'm looking, and you can have a different interpretation, right? But for the fact, when I started to think about the future and the ways that each hand try to optimize its incentive within the whole range perspective, you get some pretty precious insights, right? Because actually every hand in your range, it has an incentive, right? But in equilibrium, you're obligated to play within a macro constraint, right? There's a macro frequency that you should commit to, a macro investment that you should commit to. So your single hand incentives versus your opponent's range should commit as well at some extent to this macro policy, right? You cannot go as the single incentive for every hand, right? Because otherwise you would deviate from the macro structure. What I'm saying makes sense to you guys? And then if you play exploitatively, you can deviate more from the macro incentive, right? Sometimes you don't have to commit to the macro incentive, so the range incentive, right? You can just like look at the micro incentives for your hand, for the realization for its sake, right? In within the board structure, and you can commit more to that incentive, right? So you're not indifferent to commit to the macro incentive to generate your micro incentive, right? In equilibrium, as you're playing versus a good player and you're announcing your range, you cannot go for only the incentive of your hand, right? It's impossible. Otherwise, you're gonna lose a lot of money. One thing I don't have very clear is where you want to raise queen nine backdoor flush draw, but it's not the same for queen jack backdoor flush draw. Let's take a look at that. We don't have much. We don't have queen jack backdoor flush draw, right? We actually want to raise some, right? It's like raising with queen 10 here, right? There's raising with queen 10. They're in the same bulk, right? They are in the same bulk. They raise sometimes, and yeah. Well, if you have queen 10, if you have queen 10 of spade, it's raising, right? It's like very, very tiny frequency, almost non-existable. But within the optimization that we got here, it's like raising, right? It's raising high frequency. If you have queen spade 10 in the spot and you check on the flop, it's raising always versus the bet, right? It's the same logic, basically. Those queen highs here, they are very good raises. Okay, now let's look at turn frequencies, right? So this is like when out of position bets like 30% on the flop. This is the imposition range incentive. So we we actually make those flush draws indifferent, right? That's amazing. We don't make them indifferent to fold, right? But we make them indifferent to call, to raise, right? We obligate the imposition to have a difficult decision with Jack 3 backdoor flush draw. Why it's difficult for the imposition here with Jack 3 Jack 3 flush draw, sorry. Why do you think, guys, it's difficult here in human terms, in human language terms? Why do you think it's going to be a difficult decision for a player that thinks about the future with Jack 3 suited here? Fear of the turn bet. Yeah, I would put more or less in these terms, right? If you face a shove from that opposition player, you have roughly not odds to call, right? So it's difficult to realize versus the strategy that you're gonna face on the turn. It's difficult to realize this hand, right, as a call. But it's also why he wants to call sometimes. Well, because calling is still like a good option. Like it's difficult for you to decide here, right? Call is very good. You have a jack. If you hit the jack, you call any bet. You can hit the very good flush and make our position pay you with like dead hands on the turn, right? Because on the turn, like his pocket queens, his ace X will be dead versus your flush, right? At the same time, it's okay to call as well. So call is okay, but if you have to face the difficult decision on the turn and on the river, well, it's like, right? So those hands they get particularly indifferent, right? It's a difficult decision for them. And why is not difficult for 6-3 suited? Why 6-3 suited wants to always call? Yeah, you can just fold, right? It has less equity. So let's say a blank comes like three of hearts. Three of hearts and have 5-2. Well, you face a bet, big bet, you just fold, right? Now, if you have Jack 3, it's difficult, right? You probably have to call or have to be indifferent for a shot. Yeah. And what's the logic between among the indifference in pocket nines, the indifference in 9-8, 10-8, Jack 8? Why those hands are like more in like 9-8 here, for example, without the spade is indifferent, but 9-8 with the spade is not indifferent. Why if you look at 9-8 here in equilibrium, why the indifference is set up in the way it is here? So looking at this box here on the side here, if I go to 9-8, why is it set up in the way it is? And why the logic holds for Jack 8, Queen 8, and so on? It's constructed to call any turn. Yes, right? So you're calling way more the ones that you can be risk seeking, right? The ones that are less hurt by the out of positions player realization, right? So 9-8 with the spade, any turn you just call a shove, right? So it's like if you look at the flop strategy, you could at the first glance at that beginner level evaluate, oh, it's all mixing, like 8x is all mixing, like pocket nine is mixing, protection, and so on, right? Which most people would think about it, right? At the second glance, you can analyze in a way that's like some of them it's better to raise, some of them it's very good to call. It's very good to be risk seeking with 9-8 versus the equilibrium solution, right? That's why even the off-suited ones are indifferent, right? They call sometimes because part of your opponent's strategy is to sometimes on the three of hearts they're gonna jam some weird hands, right? They're gonna shove some hands that you really want to keep in. So it's like a force which reduces the EV of your 9-8 here because it's not clear even for the offsuited combinations whether you want to pure raise or not. They are indifferent. The EV is the same, right? The payoff is the same. So that's where you can be you could be very sensitive to your opponent type, right? How much he's risk seeking on the turn, right? How much is risk seeking on the river, right? Because furthermore, the fact there are vulnerable hands, 9-8 without the spade here is a vulnerable hand, but it's a hand that's considerable to have a pure frequency as a call over some opponent types, right? For some opponent types, it's good that you have an 8 here because sometimes they're gonna do weird stuff on the turn or even on the river if you hit 9-8 and so forth, right? The same logic's true for pocket nines, right? So you see pocket nines is calling most of the time, right? And even the ones without the spade, they're calling an okay amount. Now, as a more expert level, if you look at pocket nines, it's only calling the ones without the spade more if you have the heart and the club, right? Because if you have the diamond, calling is bad because on diamond turns, he's supposed to shove probably some hands with like the diamond, right? So you minimize the shoves that you face with weaker hands if you call nine of diamonds here. But we don't have to think about all this, but it's an optimization process here as well, right? So let's see, let me say if I get it right, nine spades, eight of spades, and nine of diamonds, eight of diamonds are always a call. And the 9-8 and 9-8 is always a shove. It's probably true, right? Yes. Always a shove? No, but most of the time, right? So it's unproportional. It's not like you you're indifferent with any 9/8 that you have, right? It's a big difference whether you want to shove 9/8 and if you have a spade or not, right? If you approach it like in let's say in no reads space, if you approach like shoving out the ones without the spade and calling the ones with the spade, it's going to be okay heuristic, simple heuristic, right? Now, of course, there is space to analyze your specific opponent, right? If your opponent is like very aggro, spewy, risk seeking on the turn, maybe you want to call even 9/8 with any 9/8 pure, right? You want to call it, right? So stuff that you can definitely think about it. Now, this is the type of indifference that you generate in your opponent's range in terms of calling and raising, right? The indifference is not only on the folding and calling or folding and raising, but also on the calling and raising, right? You make also a difficult decision for him. They're all strong hands, but they get indifferent with what to do here. It's not clear the best way that they win money, right? Because it's like it's difficult to find a fold sometimes, but it's also difficult to find a way to win money with your good hands, right? And that's a part of the indifference as well equation, right? Because when you're playing versus opponent, you're looking as well like the way that you can make the most money with strong hands. And 9 in 8x here is a very strong hand, right? So you're looking for ways that you make the most money. And part of the strategy of making the most money with 9/8 or 10/8 and Jack 8 is assuming some risk, right? You assume some risk to get sucked out on the turn. And that's fine, right? Because you were looking at the average payoff, not the payoff for this hand in a vacuum that you play, right? You cannot get attached to this hand in a vacuum, right? You have to get attached to the average payoff that you get on the turn and on the reverse that specific opponent, let's say, right? King Jack seems really indifferent. Yes. And guess what? Where it's going to be indifferent? What kind of King Jack do you think is going to be indifferent? What King Jack do you think is indifferent here? Do you think the indifference is like among all of them, or do you think it's among some specific combinations? What do you think, Mateus? What do you think, guys? What King Jack here will be raising? What King Jack gets put in a weird position here? You want to say all? Okay. I would say definitely not King Jack with the diamond. I would guess so as well, right? Because King Jack of diamonds the same, right? It's a very good hand because raising King Jack here is kind of marginal, right? It's not like a very happy raise, right? You only raise if you need to deny equity, and it's the best way to realize your hand because you're gonna get to weird positions later, right? You're gonna get to really weird, and when I say weird positions, that you're gonna get to indifference raise, right? You're gonna get to indifference later, right? You don't wanna get set up for having to let go of like okay equity later because you get indifferent, right? Yeah, my guess would be that the heart, it's the same logic as raising for the out of position player. I would guess the heart and the club will raise more here because they are the ones that will get very weird positions here with the gut shot sometimes and stuff like that. No, actually anyone without the spade. So the spade one is the one that calls the most, which I would expect, right? The spade doesn't have like so if you have like think about it like if you have king jack with the king and jack of spades, it's the same when you see bet as heads up, right? It's like really bad to bet that hand, right? To raise that hand because you make out of position. So if you raise here, what do you make out of position fold? You make him fold jack highs, right? You make him fold jack nine. You make him fold all those stuff that you really would heavily dominate later, and you have so much payoff later, right? So if you think about it in a way like you remove the fear of have to be stuck out, right? You like this is a thing from very high level in good play, right? You should remove yourself, you should detach yourself from the current payoff, right? You should devote yourself to the average payoff that you would expect, right? That's very difficult for humans, right? But once you could do that, you first of all, you have a way stronger like resilience to variance, right? You're not care about variance because you're committing to the average payoff, right? So, oh, okay, I got sucked out to for a hand that I should expect to get sucked out against. But for the sake of like my line would capture in other circumstances like way much more money than having to raise on the flop because you are fear or you don't know the payoff for your hand in the future, right? So King Jack is amazing to keep everything in, right? If you have the spade, right? You want to keep everything in because our position is betting all those kings, right? Weaker kings. It's betting all those weaker jacks, which if you raise, you fold. Like how bad it is for King Jack in the future to fold King 5. Like it's really bad, right? Really bad to and sometimes you're gonna get set out by queen nine, right? Sometimes queen nine is going to hit the queen and going to bet on the turn, you're gonna have to call, and it bets on the river, you're gonna have to fold, for example. Wow, bad. Yeah, it happens. But at the same time, sometimes he hits the king in a scenario where you hit the king as well, and you stack him off always. You always win the full stack behind, right? So sometimes you miss the opportunity to win big money later, right? Guys, are you with me? Do you accompany what I'm saying? You should commit to the average payoff on the future sometimes, right? When it's needed. And you should remove the fear of getting sucked out, right? For some hands. So if you decide to call versus an aggressive opponent, right? 10-8 here, right? Or 9-8 without the spade here. You decide to call versus some very aggressive opponent. That hand, guess what? You're gonna get sucked out sometimes. And you're gonna feel bad because you call versus the aggressive opponent, and you can justify yourself. Ah, I should not have called. This guy have jack high, and now he bets on the turn of the river and I call. But you should also see the times that he's gonna open a very weak gut shot, or he's going to have two over cards and he's going to jam to you on the turn, and you have 80% equity, right? So he has jack two here, for example, like aggressive player, right? He bets on the flop, the 10 opens on the turn, and he shoves jack two. Well, your 9-8 there would have like 90% equity or something like that. So if you raise on the flop, you miss that opportunity, right? But sometimes he's going to hit the jack and he's going to shove into you on the turn, and you're going to have 20 something percent equity. That's fine. If you commit to the payoff that you're going to get when he gets the gut shot and he shoves, that's going to be better, right? Are you getting this picture in your head, guys? What I'm saying makes sense to you? We're playing for the average payoff, right? We're not paying for the fear of getting sucked out on the future or feeling bad because our opponent seemed like he outplayed you because he get to hit a hand, right? So 10-9 here is the same, right? And 10-9 is actually fascinating. It's different. 10-9 with the spades raising more. I cannot come up with a reason for that. Probably 10-9 without the spade can find more folds on the turn. Yeah, right. If it doesn't have a pair, it can only be indifferent on the turn if it faces a. Yeah, it also interacts more with the. So if you want to raise a gut shot, open ender here, you want to make it less likely that he has the strong draws that dominates you, right? That's also logic, right? Because if you raise 10-9 with the spade, well, you make it less likely that he's going to have queen 9 with the spade, right? Queen 10 with the spade, and queen 9 with the spade himself, right? So you make it more likely that he has a hand that you have more equity against, right? You don't get dominated. So you're or evicting being dominated here. And you have more equity when called with the backdoor flush draw by default, right? So Talab is saying deviate a bit from the strategy, choosing lines that maximize EV for fear of getting out on is one of the most difficult things to learn. Yes, it is, right? Because you can only learn that if you really understand well the game, right? Because if you commit to a future payoff, you should understand where it is, right? That's the difficult part, right? That's why in the beginning it's much easier to play like very thin value lover style, right? Because you don't understand the future. So you have to commit to present policies, right? You can only have a limited look ahead from the game tree, right? When you're a beginner, you can only have a limited look ahead for the game tree, right? You can only look at a certain depth of the game, right? And then the more advanced you get, the more explore the lines, the more you know where your payoff comes from, the more you understand the ranges that are in play, the more you can look ahead, right? And you can derive the present policy from future outcomes, right? And that's the ultimate goal for poker, right? That's why pre-flop adjustments are infinite uh, place where you can approach this, right? Because pre-flop is where it all starts, right? So the balls that you commit from pre-flop, they in theory, like in theory, if you were a perfect player, really amazing player, you should think about all the branches that come from every single hand from pre-flop, right? That's why making a pre-flop policy, an effective pre-flop policy, no one can do that still, right? The tools doesn't allow us to do that effectively, right? Pre-flops it's always going to be an explored area because pre-flop in principle you should think about all the branches for estimating the payoff for your hands on pre-flop, right? But we can start to think about on the flop, right? We are looking very at a very amplify horizon here, right? For our hands, because we're analyzing on the flop the payoffs on turns and rivers here, right? We're trying to at least look at that, right? Because we don't want to emulate GTO strategies. Fuck emulate GTO strategies, right? We don't want to do that as like a default, right? We want to actually look at the payouts of our hands in the future versus that opponent and estimate what's best, right? Given that, right? Okay, now getting to what we were to get in the beginning of the coaching session after almost 1 hour is like turns, right? We're gonna look at check turns as well. How do you think the heat maps will look here for the turn for the out of positions player? Like give me the average check frequency that you think is going to get. So let's try to estimate three things. So average turn check frequency for out of position and two main used bet sizes here. If you think it's only one, it's fine as well. So we are looking here at like a simplified game tree size. So it's like a single size strategy for turn here. I simplified the game tree. So it's only selecting the highest EV sizing and it's rerun for using that size here. Only that size as a building block. So what do you think? The same thing that we saw on the last coaching session, right? What do you think here? Those 2 points. So two main use bet sizes, an average turn check frequency for the out of position player. I'm gonna say it's checking around 40%, using a small and a big size when betting. Okay. Come on, chat. Come on. What do you think? Less than 30%. Check, I would guess. Mostly shoving turns. 62% checks. Average bet size 2E. Anyone else wants to give a guess? Okay. 62% is quite specific. I like it. I like it. We should try to be really trying to give a guess. Giving a guess and confronting that with the facts is going to be a very effective way to maximize learning in the human brain, right? So that's why I'm constantly asking you because I want you to learn with this, right? It's much clearer that you're gonna learn if you try to simulate in your head what you would do, right? As like if you were trying to simulate your opponents in real time, right? But here we're trying to simulate the perfect or the optimized opponent for equilibrium here. Yeah, let's take a look at that. So here we have the heat map, and here on the left side top, we have the average frequency. So we have 42% checks and two bet sizes. Half stack, almost half stack, I think it's 2E. This is bet size and shove. Now we have shove, right? Differently from the board that we saw last week, right? Last week we look at King 5-3 Rainbow. There was like no shoving. Even on the turns that opened the flush draw, there was no shoving. Here it's like shoving, a lot of shoving. Why there is like a lot of shoving here, guys? Why differently than the last week scenario? There's like so much shoving here because of the ace. I don't know if this is the case here. You can get the answer analyzing the specific scenarios where it happens to be shoving, right? There is exactly right what Max said. There's so much draws here, right? The amount of draws here for an imposition player compared to King 5-3 is like immense, right? Because like in any turn that's like a high card or like a connected card to the 8, 7 region, like a 6, a 5, etc. We open lots of pair plus draw and gut shots and open enders and strong open enders plus overcard and all those sort of strong draws. Can you visualize that, guys? When you look at this board on the flop, you should already, like in theory, in principle, if you're like maximally strong, you should be already thinking about this on the turn, right? As out of position here, you should already be looking ahead to this, right? There is like many turns here that open strong draws and pair plus draws and stuff that your value hands or your hands that have like good amount of equity would love to end the action against, right? As out of position player. You don't want to make in position not indifferent with draws here, right? With hands that can beat your strong hands in the future. Does that make sense, guys? Can you visualize the difference between like King 5-3 and Ace 7-8 in this regard? From like turn, average turn cards hit the range differently? It's totally different, right? Texture. And you can see the what turns they bring the 2E sizing, the half stack sizing. Well, the turns that don't connect with the middle region, right? So the queen, the king, well, the queen and the king, the draws from the flop are the same on the turn, right? On the 2, on the 3 is the same logic, right? The 2 and the 3 that don't open the flush draw, it's the same, right? The same draws on the flop are on the turn. Whenever the same draws that are on the flop are in the average, the same draws that are on the turn, we still don't want to shove, right? But then when the turn opens a lot of new draws, so for example, the 2 and the 3 with the diamond is different, right? the two and the three of diamond, they actually demand a shove because there was like a lot of backdoor flush draw from the position player calling the flop. So now the added tiny, not a lot, sorry, there's not a lot, but there's a portion of the imposition. I said totally wrong. There's not a lot of backdoor flush draw calling the flop. It's not true. There's like a tiny amount of backdoor flush draw calling the flop that becomes strong draws on the turn, right? On the diamond, on top of the draws that were already available for the imposition player. And before on the king 5-3, even on the diamond, we didn't see like even if when it opened the flush draw on the turn, we didn't see a shove. Why is that? Well, because there was mostly even the flush draw open, there was like already not many draws on the flop, but that's not true here, right? Here, there's like lots of draws that called the flop, and then when it opens the diamond, seems enough to get the shove. There, it was only, I think it was like one card that shoved, and the one that was closer to shove was only when it opened like the six of diamond was a five of diamond or something like that, where it opened like some gut shots and flush shots. Then it was like one of the single only one cards they wanted to shove before. But here, like there's like way more set of turns where there seems to be a threshold for the proportion of draws in the imposition player, which pushes the forces to be wanting to shove, right? No, this is like after C bet call. This is like after C bet call. Sorry if I was like imprecise. I thought I was I was being like specific about what we were looking into. So we go back and and I say that we are looking specifically at the C bet call and turn barrel opportunity, right? From the out of position player. Why there's like still so much checking? Why there's like so much like 42% checking here? Why there's like still so much checking? We still have all those queen king highs, all those 7x and stuff like that, right? So we still have hands that cannot bet profitably, right? Let's take a look at some of the turns. Let's take a look at the 10 here. 10 of clubs. What's some patterns you can look here, guys? What's some patterns we can recognize here? There is indeed some shoving with Jack 2, Jack 3, and so forth, right? Very aggressively. 9x mostly shove here if it opens an open ender. Even some 8x are like still shoving. And again, like right, the remaining sets here they check at a high frequency, right? Pocket eights, pocket sevens, right? Nothing checks at a very high frequency, right? If you didn't improve your jack highs for a backdoor flush draw plus gut shot, you check at a high frequency, right? So the weakest hands they check at a high frequency again. King highs they check at a very high frequency and so forth, right? Yeah. So if your opponent's more risk seeking than this, it makes it better to call like 9-8 and so forth, right? On the 10 or even on the 2. There's like a lot of betting with air here, right? 10 high, jack high, so on the 2, for example, where it's like using 2e. Lots of betting with jack 5, jack 3, and so on. Now, returning to the and these low plays are like pocket kings here in this instance, right? So hands that have solid equity and interact with the check back range and so forth, right? So pocket aces seems to be a good checking as well because in position doesn't have many aces, right? And even ace X here check a lot, right? Ace Jack's checking a lot. Ace 5 is checking a lot. So we are really fast playing the hands that need protection and checking the remaining at a high frequency, right? Now the two of diamonds. Ace X still check is a high frequency. Why Ace X indifferent here, guys? Why is Ace X indifferent? Why is it indifferent? Why do you think it gets indifferent here? Why the payoff is the same if it checks? Where does it see the value from checking here? Well, the same hands that would pay them off if they bet will bet at a certain frequency, right? If we check here, the 8x will bet at a very high frequency. 7x will bet at a very high frequency, right? Pocket tens, pocket jacks, pocket queens will bet at a very high frequency. There's no much ace x in his range, right? So we don't interact with value bets and stuff like that as well, right? So it's a decent trap. The benefit of betting is ending the action versus the flush draws, right? So again, when you commit to check on ace x here, you have to understand that sometimes you're gonna get sucked out, right? Because you're gonna check, your opponent's going to check some 10-9, some jack-9, and he's going to hit on the river. You're gonna bet into him, he raises, or you're gonna check into him, he shoves, and you're gonna get sucked out, right? But at the same time, you're keeping it in hands that you would fold, that you would love, right? You keep hitting like with king highs, you keep hitting with pocket sixes, pocket fives, you keep him in with queen 10, jack 10, even the draws when they don't hit, they're gonna hit a pair that you get value from, right? So if you check and he checks back 10-9, sometimes he's going to hit the jack and beat you with your ace 5. But sometimes they're gonna check back, and they're gonna hit the 10 and you stack them off. Or they're gonna bet you raise them, right? Because ace X is always raising here if you check. Probably, or most of the time. Let's see. So 25%. Yeah, mostly raising, right? Ace X without the flush draw, mostly raising, right? You got to stack 10-9 off now, right? Now you make 10-9 call you. Before, if you shove, 10-9 would not call you, right? So you not end the action for, you're not making different 10-9, or you don't make the weaker hand call you. Now, if you check ace 5, you can make 10-9 call you, which is good, right? And you end the action for it, right? It's a way to end the action as well, right? It's not like if you check, you're going to make your opponent always realize its equity, right? If your opponent is expected to put this much amount of money in and bet those hands, it's practically speaking, you get the outcome to be the same, basically, right? Or very similar. Like you shove, you get 7x and 8x to call you. But if you check, those hands will bet at a high frequency anyways, right? So as ace X doesn't interact with the bluff region, ace 5, for example, or ace 4, don't interact as much with the bluffing region. And it gets to have the similar payoff, it checks. And ace queen, ace king, they shove at a much higher frequency, right? They have more equity versus those low ace X, right? You dominate them, right? And you interact with the region that you get value later, right? So it's better for them to generate value now, right? Ace queen and ace jack would love more to shove, right? They shove, they fold those hands here, which they interact with, but they get called by ace X, which they dominate, right? So top pairs among the calling range is like 3% of the range, so it's very insignificant. But ace queen has like worse properties here versus this region, right? Because they interact with this region, and that makes it worse for checking, right? When you check, we expect to face less bets from those bluffs and stuff that you dominate, and also you have less future value because of that, right? You you get paid less often. Now let's go back to the flop quickly, and then we're gonna end here because it's like a very heavy session already. But we can still explore this nodes here. Like there's like a lot of stuff to be get explored. Now, if you have the check line, now we have check guys, and the same questions here. Average term check frequency and main size use, two main size use as bet sizes. What do you think, guys, when we check the flop? Remember our range checking the flop. We analyzed that like in depth, right? We already know that. But now I want the answers for this. What do you think? What do you think will be the case now? 62% checks and 2E. Suggestions, guys. 52 2E. Let's take a look at that. So we have 80% checks. Wow. Why is that the case? Why so much checks? Because of the shape of the range, right? Differently than other textures, here we have a lot of air, and our air doesn't improve to value bettable hands on the turn, right? Right, guys? Our air that we check on this texture, it doesn't improve. It's different than King 5-3, for example. If we had a checking range in King 5-3, we would bet more on the turn. Not a lot, but more than this, right? Because we would hit some second pair and stuff like that on the turn. Here we don't. So take a look at this, the check frequency on the low cards. On the low cards, we actually hit some low pairs that we have to check, right? So the bet frequency on the turn here will be mainly the traps that bet sometimes here. Traps and some very few pocket queens, pocket tens, pocket jacks that we check, right? Those very few pocket queens, pocket jacks that we check on the flop, they will have to bet on the turn, right? Once our opponent checks, because they need protection. But besides that, our range doesn't improve to value bettable hands. On the king, right? On the king, on the queen, we have some bet frequency, right? The king on the queen, we have some bet frequency. And the very lowest card that doesn't open draws, we can bet our, like, for example, on the 4 here, our betting range is composed to mainly, let's see the betting range, mainly sets. The sets they bet at a high frequency, straights, and 7x, and underpairs, right? So we remove quite a bit of our sets now, right? We don't need to slow play as much anymore, right? Because in position player doesn't have many slow plays on the flop, right? So we don't need to match his slow plays anymore because he has only 4% sets now, right? And 2% straights. So we don't need to check a lot of strong hands anymore, right? We have to check less strong hands now. So inside the checking range, again, there's like 3% sets and 3% two pair, right? So only the two pair with the 7 here or the sets with the 7 we check now, right? We can bet more on king, which makes sense. I thought we should be able to bet even more. Yeah. So the thing is that you still carry a lot of air, right? Your range still carries a lot of air, even on the king. So if you pick the king here, we essentially bet the kings, but now pocket queens, pocket jacks, they have to essentially always check, right? If we have them on the range, pocket tens check at a very high frequency as well. We have all the 7x that cannot bet, right? So we have a very high region which still not cannot bet, right? Our air here cannot bet a lot. But one feature here which is interesting is that we have to bet air here, right? If we want to have some bet frequency and we want to bluff something, we don't have those jack two backdoor flush and stuff like that because we basically pure bet them on the flop, right? So you have to manage to bet some air here, right? Some queen highs without the spade, or every single one that the spade that you have low frequency checks on the flop will be bets on the turn here, right? And even on the two, for example, right? We're betting like those 5-3 here with the spade that we don't bet on the flop. 4-3. Oh, these are draws now, right? 4-3, 5-3. There are draws now, but there's like some 10-3 betting here, some Jack-3. Actually, there are just the remaining ones with the spade. So there is like some tiny amount of checks with them on the spade on the flop. It's very difficult for the human to strategize this checking range again, right? Because we probably don't wind up with any jack of spades here and stuff like that. But there's like some betting with queen X of without the spade here and some of those open draws. 6-5, 7-6, so forth. So lots of checking. And why is that? Well, because our range doesn't improve to value bettable hands, right? So we should still keep a very high check frequency, right, on turns, right? Is 50% chewy? Let me see if I have 50%. Yes, it is, right? Because I don't even have 50% of the setup bet size here. I have only 2E and 40%, so 50% is 2E. Yes. Yeah, and then then the sizes will be mainly 2E, right? 2E is the main size. There is shoving some specific turns, which is like the ace of diamonds, nine of diamonds, 10. Like in the diamonds they have shove. If you bet, it's like shoving. So for example, in the six of diamonds, there is like shoving. And the shove happens with sets, pocket eights, pocket aces shove, two pair they shove, under pair if they bet they shove as well with the draw, and second pair if they bet they shove as well. So in those like diamond turns, there's like just open shoving, which is like huge, right? It's like bet 150% of the pot. But it's very low frequency, right? Very low frequency. Why? Well, because we don't have many of those combinations that would shove, right? We just don't have many combinations. Okay, guys, I think we're gonna pause here. I have imported hands here again, but I think it's too much for today. The hands that Solver played. We can take a look at that for next week. So, any last questions, guys? I think we learned a lot today. I learned a lot today. Very interesting stuff. Okay. So, I wish you all a great weekend. Bye bye.